The Painted Bird by Jerzy Kosinski. Chapter 1. In the first weeks of World War II, in the fall of 1939, a 6-year-old boy from a large city in Eastern Europe was sent by his parents, like thousands of other children, to the shelter of a distant village. A man traveling eastward agreed, for a substantial payment, to find temporary foster parents for the child. Having little choice, the parents entrusted the boy to him. In sending their child away, the parents believed that it was the best means of assuring his survival through the war. Because of the pre-war anti-Nazi activities of the child's father, they themselves had to go into hiding to avoid forced labor into Germany or imprisonment or concentration camps. They wanted to save the child from these dangers and hoped they would eventually be reunited. Events upset their plans, however. In the confusion of the war and occupation, with continuous transfers of population, the parents lost contact with the man who had placed their child in the village. They had to face the possibility of never finding their son again. In the meantime, the boy's father's mother died within 2 months of his arrival, and the child was left alone to wander from one village to another, sometimes sheltered and sometimes chased away. The villages in which he was to spend the next 4 years differed The villages in which he was to spend the next 4 years differed ethnically from the region of his birth. The local peasants, isolated and inbred, were fair-skinned, with blonde hair, blue or gray eyes. The boy was olive-skinned, dark-haired, black-eyed. He spoke a language of the educated class, a language barely intelligible to those peasants of the East. He was considered a gypsy or a Jewish stray, and harboring gypsies or Jews whose place was in the ghettos and the extermination camps, exposed individuals and communities to the harshest penalties in the hands of the Germans. The villages in this region had been neglected for centuries. Inaccessible and distant from any urban centers, they were in the most backward parts of Eastern Europe. There were no schools or hospitals, few paved roads or bridges, no electricity. People lived in small settlements, in the manner of their great-grandfathers. Villages feuded over rights over rivers, woods, and lakes. The only law was the traditional right of the stronger and wealthier over the weaker and poorer. Divided between the Roman Catholic and the Orthodox faiths, these people were united only by their extreme superstition and the innumerable diseases plaguing man and animal alike. They were ignorant and brutal, though not by choice. The soil was poor, the climate severe. The rivers, largely emptied of fish, frequently flooded the pastures and fields, turning them into swamps. Vast marshlands and bogs cut into the region, while dense forests traditionally sheltered bands of rebels and outlaws. The occupation of that part of the country was by the Germans only deepened its misery and backwardness. The peasants had to deliver a large part of their meager crops to the regular troops on the one hand, and to the partisans on the other. Refusal to do so could mean punitive raids on the villages, leaving them in smoldering ruins. I lived in Marta's hut, expecting my parents to come for me any day, any hour. Crying did not help, and Marta paid no attention to my sniveling. She was old and always bent over, as though she wanted to break herself in half but could not. Her long hair, never combed, had knotted itself into innumerable thick braids, impossible to unravel. These she called her elf locks. Evil forces nest. I live in Marta's hut, expecting my parents to come for me any day, any hour. Crying did not help, and Marta paid no attention to my sniveling. She was old and always bent over, as though she wanted to break herself in half but could not. Her long hair, never combed, had knotted itself into innumerable thick braids, impossible to unravel. These she called elf locks. Evil forces nested in the elf locks, twisting them and slowly inducing senility. She hobbled around, leaning on a gnarled stick, muttering to herself in a language I could not quite understand. Her small withered face was covered with a net of wrinkles, and her skin was reddish-brown, like that of an overbaked apple. Her withered body constantly trembled, as though shaken by some inner wind, and the fingers of her bony hands, with joints twisted by disease, never stopped quivering as her head, on our long, scraggly neck, nodded in every direction. Her sight was poor. She peered at the light through tiny slits embedded under thick eyebrows. Her lids were like furrows in deep plowed soil. Tears were always spilling from the corners of her eyes, coursing down her face in well-worn channels to join gluttonous threads hanging from her nose and the bulby saliva dripping from her lips. She sometimes looked like an old green-gray puffball, rotten through and waiting for the last gust of wind to blow out the back dry dust from inside. At first I was afraid of her, and closed my eyes whenever she approached me. All I could sense then was the foul smell of her body. She always slept in her clothes. They were, according to her, the best defense against the danger of the numerous diseases which fresh air might waft into the room. To ensure health, she claimed a person should wash no more than twice a year, at Christmas and Easter, and even then very lightly, without undressing. She used hot water only to relieve her innumerable corns, bunions, and the ingrown toenails on her gnarled feet. That is why she soaked them once or twice a week. Often she stroked my hair with her old, trembling hands that were so like garden rakes. She encouraged me to play in the yard and make friends with the household animals. Eventually, I realized that they were less dangerous than they appeared. I remember the stories about them, which my nurse used to read to me from the picture book. They had their own life, these animals, their loves and disagreements. They held discussions in a language of their own. The hens crowded the chicken house, jostling one another to reach a grain I threw to them. Some strolled in pairs, others pecked weaker ones and took solitary baths in puddles after the rain or the foppishly ruffled their feathers over their eggs and quickly fell asleep. Strange things happened in the farmyard. Yellow and black chicks hatched out of the eggs, resembling little live eggs on spindly legs. Once a lonely pigeon joined the flock. He was clearly unwelcome. When he made the landing in a flurry of wings and dust amidst the chickens, they scurried away, frightened. When he began to court them, cooing, gutturally, and approaching them with his menacing step, they stood aloft and looked at him with disdain. They invariably ran away, clucking, as soon as he drew closer. One day, when the pigeon was trying, as usual, to consort with the hens and the chicks, a small black shape broke away from the clouds. The hens ran screaming through the barn and the chicken coop. The black ball fell like a stone on the flock. Only the pigeon had no place to hide. Before he even had time to spread his wings, a powerful bird with a sharp hooked beak pinned him to the ground and struck at him. The pigeon's feathers were speckled with blood. Marta came running out of the hut, brandishing a stick, but the hawk flew off smoothly, carrying its beak a limp body of the pigeon. Marta kept a snake in a special small rock garden, carefully fenced in. The snake slithered among the leaves, sinuously, waving its forked tongue like a banner in a military review. It seemed quite indifferent to the world. I never knew if it noticed me. On one occasion, the snake hid itself deep under the moss in its private quarters, staying there for a very long time, without food or water, participating in strange mysteries about which even Marta preferred to say nothing. When it finally emerged, its head glistened like an oiled plum. An incredible performance followed. The snake sank into immobility with only very slow shivers running along its coiled body. Then calmly, it crawled out of its skin, looked suddenly thinner and younger. It did not wave its tongue any more, but seemed to wait for its new skin to harden. The old, semi-translucent skin had been completely discarded and was marked upon by disrespectful flies. Marta lifted the skin with reverence and hid it to a secret place. A skin like this had valuable remedial properties, but she said it was too young to understand. I was too young to understand their nature. Marta and I had watched this transformation with amazement. She told me that her human soul discards the body in a similar manner and then flies up to God's feet. After its long journey, God picks it up with his warm hands, revives it with his breath, and then either turns it into a heavenly angel or casts it down into hell for eternal torture by fire. A small red squirrel often visited the hut. After a meal, it would dance a jig in the yard, beating its tail, uttering tiny squeaks, rolling, jumping, and terrorizing the chickens and pigeons. The squirrels visited me daily, sitting on my shoulder, kissing my ears, necks, and cheeks, teasing my hair with its light touch. After playing, it would vanish, returning to the wood across the field. One day I heard a voice and ran to the nearby rise. Hiding in the bushes, I was horrified to see some village boys chasing my squirrel through the field. Running frantically, I tried to reach the safety of the forest. The boys threw rocks in front of it to cut it off. The tiny creature weakened. It leaped, shortened, and slowed. The boys finally caught it, but it bravely continued to struggle and to bite. Then the boys, bending over the animal, poured some liquid from a can into it. Feeling that something horrible was about to be done, I tried desperately to think of some way to save my little friend, but it was too late. One of the boys took a piece of smoldering wood out of the can, slung it over his shoulder, and touched the animal with it. Then he threw the squirrel to the ground. it immediately burst into flames. With a squeal that stopped my breath, it leapt up as if to escape from the fire. The flames covered it. Only the bushy tail still wagged for a second. The small, smoldering, smoking body rolled on the ground and was so soon still. The boys looked on, laughing and prodding the tiny body with a stick. With my friend dead, with my friend dead, I no longer had anyone to wait for in the morning. I told Marta what had happened, but she did not seem to understand. She muttered something to herself, prayed, and cast her secret